tonight's meeting of the Oxford Communist Correspondence Society. Had one apology, which is from Mike, who would have liked to be here, but he has to be in Berlin debating the platypus. The format for tonight's meeting is, as usual, we'll begin with an introductory talk, which will be given by Nikos, who's a special guest speaker, and he's going to be talking on the topic Marx and the phases of capitalist development. We'll then have an opportunity for brief questions that the speaker can answer briefly. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, and we've got to be out by 9 o'clock. So, Nikos, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to be with you here. And before starting, apologies, because I'll be a bit unstructured. And you can see it from the extremely large handout, which includes many quotes that I'm not sure I will have the chance to speak about, as I hope, but nevertheless. The topic, as kind of suggested, was Marx and the phases of capitalist development, or evolution? Development. There are two main themes I wanted to talk about. The first one concerns the duality between the law of accumulation in chapter 25 of volume 1 with the law of the falling rate of profit, chapters 13 to 15 in volume 3. And as you'll see from the handout, the only quotations from volume 3 are two extremely annoying references towards the end. The rest of it is just volume 1. The reason for that is I think that the law is actually proved in volume 1, which for me it would settle a big debate around that law. The second part is to show how this law is important in understanding the different phases through which capitalism has evolved and what is the state that we are right now. So without further ado, let me give you a brief description of the law. I'm pretty sure that most of you are already acquainted with it. The law of the falling rate of profit states that if the organic composition of capital, that is the mass of constant capital divided by the mass of variable capital, rises more than the rate of surplus value, then the rate of profit is bound to fall. I'm phrasing the law in this way because the law is not only about the rate of profit falling. Actually, many economists before and after Marx have argued that the rate of profit, or the equivalent, depending on the theory, like the marginal rate of productivity of capital, etc., should be falling, whether logically or historically. But for Marx, it falls for a specific reason, and this is that the organic composition of capital rises faster than the rate of surplus value. That's also, the law is not complete in Marx's understanding if one does not discuss why this happens, and also does not include what chapter 14 is about, the so-called counter tendencies or counter influences, depending on the translation. So in order to understand why the organic composition of capital rises, or should rise logically, faster and more than the rate of surplus value, one has to go all the way back to Capital Volume 1 and essentially start the discussion from the production of absolute and relative surplus value. This, by the way, is not irrelevant with what happens, what the rate of profit, of the falling rate of profit tries to say. If we have a history of crisis and of evolution of capitalism encoded in that law, then this is the same that Marx is talking about in those parts in volume 1. Again, for brief reference, you can see all the several of these. I'll try to discuss briefly all the quotations from Marx himself. What happens in, I think it's chapters 7 till 15 essentially, he discusses not only the theoretical premises of what production of surplus value means within capitalism, but also the historical reasons for the production of surplus value. Marx makes the case that historically the subsumption of labor to capital happens first of all formally, and formally means just the emergence of wage labor, the emergence of contracted labor, the emergence of this state of this relation between the owner of the means of production and the non-owner that has to sell their labor power. This is simply a formal relation, a formal subsumption of the latter to the former, which happens merely because the means of production are owned by the former, and the result of it is the control of the length of the working day by the capitalist. This creates the emergence of the absolute surplus value, that is, surplus value that can be created by extending the working day beyond the amount that is necessary for the worker to reproduce themselves, their household, their family, etc. However, and that's the first quotation, there is a limit, an upper limit to this extension. The working day cannot be, first of all, decreased below the minimum of the mere biological subsistence of the worker, and it cannot be extended beyond their physical and their moral bounds. After that, Marx discusses the more important historical process, which is the real subsumption of labor to capital, and this has to do with not just the formal form of the wage labor, someone who just contracts himself to work for another person, but has to do with the control the other person has over the labor process and their ability to change the nature of labor process. This is the whole discussion about not controlling the length of the working day, but controlling the value of the labor power, the intensity of the working day, and eventually the productivity of the worker, the division of labor, and in the end, the introduction of machinery, first of all by extending the tools, then by creating what Marx calls the detailed worker and the collective worker, etc., etc. I will not discuss all these wonderful quotations in detail as I hoped, but the idea here is that when the upper bound of the working day is met for either physical or moral reasons, the only way that capitalism can surpass this is either by cheapening the means of reproduction of the worker, or by introducing new techniques of production through which the worker becomes more productive. Marx actually used the words productiveness and productive power, if I remember correctly, of the worker. He doesn't use the word productivity, and this is rather interesting, but I leave translating issues aside. And again, apparently, it seems that capitalism has an ability of indefinitely raising the productivity of the worker, as though indefinitely raising what Marx calls the production of relative surplus value, that is the production of surplus value by changing the value of labor power or by intensifying the working day. But again, looking closely to what Marx talks about, there are also upper limits here. So it's not just the physical and moral limits of extending the working day beyond, they're not just these physical and moral limits of extending the working day, but they're also physical and moral limits in intending the working day, making it more intensive. So even if the capitalists can do that, they can only do it by, first of all, employing large amounts of capital, because every time that we try to make the working day more intensive and the worker more productive, we have to assume that new tools and new machinery are being employed in the production process. And of course, we cannot do that without counter-reaction from society, the most famous of which is probably the Luddite movement, historically speaking. Today we could speak about strikes happening, not as much as one would expect, strikes happening against the emergence of the artificial intelligence. Just reminding here, for example, that the strike of the Hollywood screenwriters 2 years ago was very much based on the idea that AI can now write screenplays, so they would lose their job. So we still have this reaction of the worker and of their environment to this further mechanization of the labor process. The point of going through all this is to show that Marx has already put the laws of motion of the rate of surplus value, whether that's the absolute or the relative, or both, in chapters, I think it's parts 3, 4, and 5, essentially, of volume 1. I won't attempt to mention the chapters, but that's where this happens. So we don't only have the laws of the evolution of the rate of surplus value, but we also have all the inner and outer bounds that this evolution has at every single moment of time. the fact that we cannot extend the working day beyond a certain point, the fact that we cannot intensify the working day beyond a certain point without meeting a reaction from the workers is simply that fact. It states the fact that the rate of surplus value can indeed rise and does rise, but it does rise with a certain upper limit. Also, as the rate of surplus value rises, and this means essentially that the productivity of the worker rises, at the same time this can only happen if the amount of physical capital employed, of constant capital as Marx calls it, employed also rises, and it doesn't just rise, but it has to rise more and faster than the amount of variable capital, is the amount of workers that are being employed also rises. This is discussed by Marx in chapter 15, where he relays the whole story of modern industry, of the modern factory system, exactly because the introduction of the machinery and the mechanization of the labor process reflects this rise of the mass of constant capital, and both the physical mass but also the value of constant capital beyond the variable capital. So by the time that he reaches chapters 24 and 25, where he discusses the general law of capital accumulation, he has already set the stage. He has already set the stage for both the rise of the surplus value and what the rate of surplus value and what that requires, which is, among other things, first of all, the real and absolute subsumption of the labor process to the capital. This doesn't happen in historical vacuum. These historical processes have to happen. And secondly, that the amount of capital employed must always be rising faster than the rate of surplus value. So when in chapters 24 and 25 Marx discusses the actual law, which is nothing but the increase, the permanent increase of the organic composition of capital as a fundamental law for the evolution of capitalism, he has already mentioned these things. This is, in a sense, a proof, you could even state that as a small theorem, that what Marx says in chapter 13 and 14 and 15 of volume 3 merely follows from what he has said in half of volume 1. If these things hold, then what he says in volume 3 must hold. There is a small transgression that has to do with the transformation problem and whether we measure everything in terms of values or prices in order to have this average rate of profit. But if one is allowed to make this as a leap of faith at this point, the falling rate of profit is merely the dual of the law, the general law of capitalist accumulation from volume 1. And if one accepts that the law of capital accumulation follows and is proved by what Marx says in the chapters preceding it, then the law of the falling rate of profit is already proved. Going back to where I started from, I told you that many economists believe that the rate of profit is falling. We see that from Adam Smith, we see that from David Ricardo, we see that from Malthus, we see it also in economists following Marx or even taking different directions from Marx, like Marshall and Keynes and Schumpeter. Many economists, great or not, believed that the rate of profit was falling. And again, the point is not just to say whether the rate of profit is falling or not. This is an empirical artifact. This is something that may happen or may not. For Marx, there is a specific reason that the rate of profit is falling, and this falling, this long-run tendency of the rate of profit to fall reflects this contradiction within capitalism, that in order for the capitalists to create a bigger mass of surplus value, which they can only do by raising the rate of surplus value and through this the productivity of the worker, they can only do that, and in a sense this is a contradiction of the of capitalism, by raising not the variable component of capital but the constant component of capital. So they have to raise the organic composition sometimes more and faster than they manage to raise the productivity of the worker and the rate of the surplus value. One could argue, and I'll push you to look at some of the diagrams towards the end, the very last page is the rate of profit in the US in two different periods, and before that is the rate of profit in the UK for about the same period. So it starts somewhere in the 19th century, mid-19th century, and goes all the way to early 21st. One could say that we see Marx is kind of confirmed because we can see the rate of profit falling. You could see the same in other countries. You could see the same in the entire world. The average rate of profit, depending on measurement, of course, seems to have this declining trajectory over decades or even centuries. But that doesn't tell us much. It doesn't tell us much because there is no explanation as to why it's falling. One should look at the components of the rate of profit to see whether they confirm Marx's understanding or not. I cleverly didn't put them in. But I could argue that to the extent that we can measure, and they usually do, the organic composition of capital is rising faster than the rate of surplus value. So from that extent, Marx's law is confirmed. But the second problem that would arise at that point is that what does it mean that Marx's law is confirmed? Marx's law is not just a logical assumption that tells us that the rate of profit is falling. That's fine. Nothing happens with that. You could imagine that, like Smith, you would assume that there's a final stationary point at which the rate of profit will be so small, effectively zero, that investment would stop and capitalism would collapse like a falling star within a black hole, collapse in itself. But that's not Marx's point. Marx's point is to make a historical statement about capitalism. And again, taking you back and forth from volume 3 to volume 1, the whole discussion about the proof of the law is a discussion about the history of the emergence of the industrial system, the emergence of the machinery, the emergence of the cooperation, the emergence of the division of labor, and the different forms that the division of labor has taken. Now, Marx has also said at some point in, I think it would be the very last quotation that I have over here. Yes, it is the very last quotation I have over here, that this falling rate of profit is related to all the odd and pardon my expression, bad things that happen with capitalism. It is related, it breeds, as Marx says, overproduction, it breeds speculation, crisis, and surplus capital alongside surplus population. So everything that we see as a fundamental problem in our everyday life about capitalism, the fact that we have crisis, the fact that we have financialization, the fact that we have a rising cost of living, the fact that we have overproduction versus underconsumption, the fact that we have inflation and unemployment and all these things can be traced back, according to Marx, not only on the historical conditions that form it, but also on this long-run evolution of the rate of profit. And this is probably the best thing that we can say. The only reasoning for anyone, not only Marxist, but anyone with a good understanding of the history of capitalism, of the economic history of capitalism, in looking at the trajectory of the rate of profit, is if we can relate what happens at every moment with the different phases that capitalism has taken. And of course, if one asks around, you could say capitalism started after the Industrial Revolution. Actually, started before the Industrial Revolutions, but the Industrial Revolutions give us a good starting point to understand the specifically capitalist mechanisms like the mechanization, the division of labor and the mechanization of the labor process to start with. The real subsumption of labor rather than the formal one. And every step that it took, every new revolution that it took, it came along with, first of all, a different framework, institutional and legal framework of the labor process, but also a different technical framework for the labor process. Now this is, unfortunately, this is not Marx. It's a funny instance, this is not Marx. This is something that was discussed decades after Marx and to a certain extent in a very anti-Marxist reasoning and terminology. This is the question about the long waves that capitalism goes through. I don't know whom, for every one of us, it was, I believe, Dobb and Mandel, two very important Marxist economists, that brought the discussion to the Marxist premises and actually tried to relate it to the falling rate of profit. And there is research today that allows us to link the different phases, different long phases, different long waves, if you want, of capitalism with the falling tendency of the rate of profit, and also link the different historical moments, the changes that happened every time we move from one wave to another, exactly to the counter tendencies of the rate of profit. So, just to give you a simple example, the movement, so the first long wave as it is recorded, there are probably long waves before that, but that's the first one that we can safely speak about, starts with the huge expansion after 1790 all the way to 1810s, 1820s, and then we have this first Great Depression from 1815 to about 1840, 1845. There are many reasons for that decline. People speak about the Napoleonic Wars, people speak about the first reaction to the colonies collapsing, etc., etc. But it's important to see what happens, first of all, in the expansionary era and then in the recessionary era. So in the expansionary era, it's the moment that we have the first early industry. I mean, if one looks at the moment that workshops become the first factories, is about that time. It's the late 18th century. We also have the first developed banking systems. It's really interesting to think that it was at the time that London becomes an important financial center, for example, and that banks are being heavily regulated especially after the big bubbles that happened like a century ago. And during the recessionary era, it's the moment that we have the transition from the use of water power to the use of steam power. Is the moment that a heavy iron industry transforms into a heavy steel industry. It's the moment that we have railways and shipping being evolved into something much more expanding and much faster, much more efficient that now capitalism can use in order to bring raw materials and send the commodities, the final goods everywhere. Similarly speaking, the next long cycle, its rise that is after 1845 and until the early 1870s is the moment that we have the actual factories that Marx is talking about in part 4 of volume 3. This description of the factories is exactly what happens at this time. At the same time, this is usually downplayed, is the first time that we see a welfare system in many of the continental European states, like Bismarck's Germany. And when we move to the recessionary period is exactly the moment that steam power starts being, by the way, the recessionary period is the long depression, the silent depression from 1870s to 1890s, essentially. And it's the moment that capitalism transforms from using steam power to using electricity, from using coal to fuel the factories to using electric power. It's also the time that chemicals are introduced and they become a very important innovation to the heavy industry. And of course, the engines of internal combustion are also introduced at that point and allow the expansion of capitalism in the third long cycle. I could keep going on about that, but I think it's self-obvious what happens afterwards. The chemicals are substituted by petrochemicals, electricity by electronics. Then electronics are substituted by, replaced by the digital networks. Now we can speak about digital networks being replaced by artificial intelligence. The old Fordist understanding of the labor process now being replaced by 3D printing, etc., etc. And all the moment that this happens is the moment that the rate of profit falling creates a recessionary period. The old conditions, whether the institutional framework of the labor process or the technical framework of the labor process, are not sufficient to keep the system going, and necessarily, in order to survive, capitalism sort of invokes those counter tendencies of the rate of profit. What are the counter tendencies, by the way? I never spoke about them. First of all, it's the question of foreign trade. That's why I often mention the market openness or the imperial era, the use of the colonies, etc., etc. Another one is cheapening of the technology of the fixed capital and of the technology that produces goods. Essentially, every innovation that is introduced allows to the industries that introduce it to do that cheaper and sell cheaper, so they can see their market shares rising and their profit going up. And of course, the most important of all, the rate of surplus value has to start rising. That's the only way that one can get out of a crisis and into a new phase of boom. And by introducing a new technique and raising labor productivity, the first thing is that the rate of surplus value will rise. The second one is by one thing that I'm not really mentioning here, but it's very important in Marx. Many of these transitions involve a change in our way of life. I think Marx, my favorite example from Marx is how British workers started drinking tea. It's exactly because it would be cheaper than coffee, but would do the same work. So it's a cheapening of the means to reproduce labor power, but at the same time keeping the productivity as high as it would anyway. This is again a change that happens through one of these ebbs and flows. Of course, these are related to many other things that happen. For example, if you see the statistics in that table where all these are recorded, if you see the number of wars that happen in the expansionary versus the recessionary period, you can see an obvious difference. The same thing with sovereign defaults, etc., etc. But I will not go further into that. Why is this important for Marxian economics and Marxism in general? I think that's the closure of it. Marx wanted to, there's this rumor, by the way, that Marx's fourth volume of Capital would probably be a historical description of capitalism rather than a history of economic thought, which is the theories of surplus value. This probably was never written, and I'm not sure even if the intention remained in his mind, but I think this would be the fitting end of Capital if Marx managed to do it, because the point is not to understand what capital can do in abstract. This is the beginning of a thought process. Capital in abstract is the beginning. We have to understand what capital in general does in order to speak about actual historical issues. And the fundamental historical issue is to see where capitalism is going. The reason this table stops in 20 question marks is exactly because we are still in that recessionary phase that started 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis in the US, the fiscal crisis in the Eurozone. And it's something that we haven't yet escaped. The stagflation that we are seeing, the rising cost of living, the wars and the genocide that we are going through are probably part of that greater change in history. And all the questions about, I think at least, AI replacing human labor, 3D printing, revolutionizing industry, and I don't know what. Even the question of military Keynesianism that seems to be restructuring the way our economies work are part of capitalism trying to find an exit out of the current recessionary era. So a good reason to study these things is to see where capitalism is going and whether we can prevent any evil that would bring with it. I think I'll put my full stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nikos. Anybody have any questions, either points of fact or something that you need clarified, things that the speaker can answer in a sentence or two rather than needing to give another talk? Yes.
Just a quick definition of real subsumption.
Oh, yes. So the way to distinguish the formal from the real, essentially formal is just a change in the form of the labor process. So the fact that labor consumes materials to produce use values is a very abstract definition of the labor process. When this happens for these use values to be exchanged for a surplus value, is a formal subsumption, because the only thing that changes is the form. When the owner of the means of production who now controls it has the ability to change the nature, for example, mechanize the labor process. This is the real subsumption. That now they have control over how the labor process is conducted, not just control over the worker that they're just paying the workers. But this is the formal thing. The fact that they can change the relation is the real subsumption.
Any other questions? Yes.
How come some of the boxes are
empty?
Does that mean no data?
So this is for the fifth cycle. There are many empty boxes because we're not sure when it will end, so we cannot make the measurement. For the earlier cycles, this is like the first, second, and so on. This is because we don't have data for these things. For the fourth cycle and the basic innovations, I will just say, and that's a mistake from my part, this is a table that comes from some of my co-authors. And I'm not sure why this happened. I asked them at some point, but I don't remember the response. So I will not try to claim why I know this. This fourth cycle, this is really a paradox. I don't know what happens. We should know that. And I think we should know it, by the way, because we have the number of the patterns, and that's what they use for that. So you should know it. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions, Ian?
So, what's the criteria for splitting, for identifying the cycles? Is it quantitative or is it qualitative?
So it's a mixture. So the next graph, which I didn't really discuss very much, is an attempt to extend Kondratiev's graph. Kondratiev was a Soviet statistician who was the first one to study this long cycles, and he was using price indices. And what was happening at the time was that during a massive crisis, the price would go up and then down. So you could see inflation, deflation. Inflation was the expansionary era, deflation was the recessionary era. This thing was well recorded up to 1930s. So Kondratiev's actual timeline is still there, and you can see how some of the prices actually went up and then down. So you can have an idea of where the expansion stops and the recession starts. What happens after is that you have to continue reconstructing it in a specific way, which is to divide by the price of gold, because what happens after the 30s is the Bretton Woods, and now the prices work on their own. But if you divide it by the price of gold, that's what you see. You can still see the next two waves, and you can see more or less where the expansion starts, when it stops, and the recession goes down. Now, to confirm that, we also looked at whether a massive event like 1929 crash happened around that time. So you can see that the expansionary era of the third cycle ends in the early 1920s, and then the crash follows. So it makes sense. Similarly, for the fifth cycle, you see that it ends after the dot-com bubble, and then the 2007-8 crisis follows. So there was a mixture of data to find these dates. By the way, if you look to older publications of the same authors, they have slightly different dates. So looking at different time series, you may have small changes, but yeah, that's what happens with it.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
You said at some point the constant capital must rise faster than the rate of surplus value as a counter tendency. Why must it? There's something I'm missing.
As a counter, the rate of surplus value must rise faster. No, there are two things conflated here, I think. The one is that the mass and the value of the constant capital must rise faster than the value and the mass of the variable capital. This happens because, at least Marx's reasoning behind that is that if you want to raise the productivity of the worker, you have to supply the worker with better means of production, better instruments of work. So after some point, you end up investing in massive stock, like machinery, like new buildings, like all of these things, which rise faster than the labor force is rising. So this gives you this proportionality that in order to make the worker more productive, that's a tendency. The counter tendency is the opposite, that if you want to escape out of this spiral, what you have to do is to allow either your capital to devalue, which of course happens during a crisis because you have bankruptcies, because you have not proper maintenance, etc., or to find a way to raise the productivity more than the organic composition. And a way to do it is either to invest in recent, less costly and more efficient technologies, or to increase the discipline, which is something I didn't mention, which can also happen during a recessionary period. Pay goes down and the discipline of the labor force goes up. So this is the counter tendency.
Any other questions?
I have one last quick
One
question.
last question.
Is that right?
It certainly is.
You seem to be suggesting that the innovation is driven by the downturn and the fall of rate of profit. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, with one footnote. Innovation is not the invention of a new technology. is the application of that new technology for a market-oriented purpose. To give you a simple example, the World Wide Web is something that we have from the 50s. It became the massive innovation at the 80s when neoliberal stabilization was trying to take us out of stagflation. So it's the moment that we go from the downturn to the upturn. And supposedly that was the innovation that helped us go out. It's also the one that creates the dot-com bubble, etc., etc.
Okay.
So it's when capitalists use it, not when it's invented.
Thank you.
You. Last call for questions. If not, we will go into general discussion, and so this discussion primarily for the audience. Nikos will get a chance at the end to reply to any points that he'd like to. So over to you, anybody.
Just wondering what the name of the book you co-authored. Is it a few books based on this talk? Or
Sorry?
Did you say you co-authored?
Oh, yeah. So when I did my PhD, I was supervised by Persephone Tsaliki, and kind of co-advisor in the committee was your husband, Lefteris Tsourpidis. They're both professors of political economy back in Greece and neighboring institutions. And after I finished my PhD, we kind of collected. My PhD was a model of cyclical growth based on Marx's principles. That's why all this discussion. We later published a book, and most of these graphs are from this book. So also the table here is on that book.
Thank you. Discussion points, anybody? Yeah.
You covered a great deal.
That's true.
And it's useful for me because I will freely admit to not really fully grasping Marx's point about the falling rate of profit. In fact, I've avoided really thinking about it. So what I'm going to say is I'm not committed to anything I'm about to say. This is more wondering aloud, right? But there's something that slightly bothers me about the argument because I don't understand it. I'm not saying it's wrong, I just don't understand it. So when you say the rate of surplus value, do you mean the surplus value divided by the sum of the constant and variable capital? Is that what you mean by the rate?
The variable.
Constant and variable, yeah.
No, that's the rate of profit. The rate of surplus value is just the surplus value over the
S
variable.
over V, right.
Yeah. Or rate of exploitation, according to some people.
Okay. So that isn't really a rate, is it? That is strictly a ratio. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's been confusing me all along about this. Is that the rates may not be changing at all, and that ratio could be constant. When I think of a rate, I think of a rate of change.
Over time.
Over time, yes, certainly. Whereas S over V is literally a ratio, and to me, you could almost see it as a distributional variable, quite unconnected to changes in the productivity of labour, changes in the intensity of working, or changes in the length of the working day. So this is where I stumble, right at the very beginning, because this isn't clear to me. I'll stop there for a moment and let other people speak, but I want to think about it more for what I just said. But this is where I hesitate, and I don't even get going, because I stumble into this conceptual issue in my head. Maybe I'm sure it's clearer in other people's.
Anybody else?
Yeah, my knowledge is just even more scrappy and sketchy. I think we get the general gist of the rate of profit for theory idea that, correct me if I'm wrong, organic composition of capital is composed of fixed and variable capital together.
Constant versus variable, yeah.
and variable capital is seen as labour power. That's right. It's variable.
The value of the labor power.
The value of labour power. So the more the fixed capital is invested in to increase productivity, the less need there is for variable capital because it's more productive. If it's more productive, if there's less need for the value of labour power, then less surplus is extracted, which is the basis of profit. So over time, the more this logic continues, then that I understand is the fall in the rate of profit, based on a limited source of labour power. My question, I guess, is the variable capital, labour power, can change. There's always more labour, more employable labour. How would that relate to the tendency to expand markets, to lower barriers to migration? That's just one, historically, where, say, for instance, founding of the EU, maybe as an example.
Or NAFTA.
Just one more thing. Just on the first quote, Marx says about the working day being a fixed quantity. Well, we all know it's 24 hours. He was writing at a time prior to the Taylorism, Fordism system, and also beyond that, the 24-hour economy where shifts, production never ceases because you have a range of shifts that take over. So, does that still hold, where production is constant and it's not exhaustible but continues? Does that affect the logic of his argument? I'm not sure, I need to read it properly.
Anybody else want to come in? Yeah.
In the beginning of your talk, you pointed to this question of the equalising tendencies within capitalism, which balance out the crisis tendencies. When Adam Smith was writing about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, he assumed that it would eventually end in that one of the problems with the rate of profit is that workers keep pushing for wage increases, and that they try to close that gap between the amount they produce and the amount that the capitalist takes away, and that at some point wages would stop falling, would stop increasing, that there would be a kind of horizon upon which this thing would steadily come to some point, which it appears not to have done as a cyclical crisis. But nonetheless, there are these. For example, you mentioned stagflation. The potential that we might come to some point at which wages don't rise, capital is not productive, and yet there's no major crisis, and it just kind of continues.
Anybody else? Yeah.
So again, my perplexity about Marx's theory, not your description of it, I should point out. Again, it's a naive question, right? If the rate of surplus value is S over V, okay, obviously there's no C in that equation. So why would it be the case that a rising organic composition of capital would have any causal effect on S over V? Given the observation that if you think about both the value and mass of constant capital that existed in the 16 and 1700s compared to what we have today. Obviously, there's vastly more constant capital in the world. And yet, profitability isn't that bad, and the rate of surplus value presumably isn't that bad either. So, the question is, why is it a problem that the existence of more constant capital, the existence of more machinery and tools, essentially mechanized forms of labour, why would that make it difficult to increase the rate of surplus value?
Anybody else? I mean, I'll just come in briefly on a side angle, and thank you, Nikos. A very interesting talk, very thought-provoking. I'm a little bit worried about the long cycles. I mean, if looking at them on this graph, I can see the third and fourth, but I can't see the second. And if you drew the vertical lines in different places, you could, up to a point, shuffle around and say, oh look, there's a bit of an upsurge in the 1860s. That's a cycle starting, and then it's got its recessionary phase. And I think something that adds to my concern about that is that if you ask people based on purely political criteria to pick turning points at about 50 or 60 year intervals, then they're going to say the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions of 1848. That matches one pretty much. They're certainly going to say the Second World War, and that's one of them. And they'll say, oh, we can't have the First World War because we've got to make it 50 or 60. But we'll make it turn from an expansionary phase into a recessionary phase around the First World War, and that does work out. So it looks a lot like a political pattern that's been imposed on the material, and I'm not convinced that these cycles in economic terms are obvious. That might have started a few hairs running. If anybody else wants to come in. Yeah,
so this is something you can definitely help me with, and I've tried this out on a few Marxist economists, and they're either bewildered and don't know what I'm talking about, and that's perhaps because I don't know what I'm talking about. But the latest one I tried it out on said it was absurd what I was saying, so that was good. That's at least, I think you might understand what I was trying to say. But I want to try it on you because it will help me, because I'm literally unsure. So I think there's a reading. So I think you're right that volume 1 is where it happens, right? Totally. And but there's a reading of volume 1 which I definitely had to begin with, where again surplus value and the split of the working day into necessary and surplus parts comes across, or well, you can read it as a distributional thing, right? It's how much time we spend working to reproduce our means of consumption. The rest of it is for the capitalist investment, what have you. But of course, as Marx points out, that split depends on the value of the real wage, right? Yeah, because production of relative surplus value would involve reducing the value of the real wage, and therefore reducing the necessary part of the working day. So there's a different reading of what he's saying, which is a more dynamic reading about rates of change, where the production of absolute surplus value and relative surplus value isn't the production of that surplus part of the day. It's the production of a change in that ratio. So the production of absolute surplus value is a lengthening of the working day given the length of the working day. It's the intensification of labour given the current intensity of labour. It is a reduction in the value of the real wage given the current distribution and balance of and the way that the net product is divided amongst the classes. And that's different, that's dynamic. It's not a distributional thing, it's about a change of distribution. And from that point of view, you would perhaps, and maybe this is what you're looking at, just not understood you, but perhaps you'd look at the tendency of the rate of profit to fall due to a higher organic composition of capital is simply due to the fact that the variable capital, i.e. us, the creative element in the labour process, which he says right in this first quote you've got here, it is it the first quote? It's a variable quantity. So it varies during the production process. It varies because what it produces, what it can do, is undetermined. It's not measurable. It's not determinate, and that's because it's creative. It's living labour. And so, if you imagine a massive warehouse of cloud computers, fully automated, and there's one person just looking at a monitor, versus a similar warehouse with the same amount of constant capital, but for whatever reason it's a slightly different production process and there's 100 people thinking about it, the probability that there's going to be innovation in one versus the other is quite starkly different. And to me that makes sense, that an increasing organic composition capital lowers the rate of surplus value as a rate of change of the production of innovations, etc. and so forth. And that's what I tried to explain the other day to someone who said that's absurd and untenable. So I'd be interested in your point of view.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't quite know what I want to say, so I'll just start reading and see what comes out. I find it very, very difficult to. I'm not an economist, I can say this. I know very little about economics. I do understand mathematics, so I can kind of follow some of the reasoning that's that's being talked about here. And I think that I've read something like 2/3 of volume 1, and that was around about 2007 or thereabouts, so it was a long time ago. So my knowledge of this is very, very rudimentary. But a couple of points is that I find it very, very difficult, and this is, and I don't expect anybody to make it easier for me here because it's a big question, but I find it very difficult to get my head round the concept of the capitalist system as a whole, because I can kind of imagine things from the point of view of an individual capitalist firm. I can imagine that the idea of whether or not they might want to take on more workers or lay off workers or buy machinery or buy computers or whatever it is to increase the productivity of the workforce. I can understand that, but I just find it very difficult to get how that translates into the capitalist system as a whole. So when people talk about the rate of profit, I can visualize that for an individual firm. I can't really visualize what that means for capitalism as a whole. I don't know if I've not really explained that very well. And so okay, so I might sort of try and clarify that in a moment. But the other thing that gets me about this table here is a list of basic innovations. You've got in what's called the first long cycle, and I tend to agree with Ed that I don't really see any reason for drawing those vertical lines in that graph in the places where they're drawn. But I can kind of I can understand as to basic innovations. You've got water, power, textiles, iron, and then you've got the advance for steam, railways, electricity, chemicals, the internal combustion engine, and then the, electronics, aviation, digital network, and now we've got artificial intelligence. It does seem to me that this is a process, you know, again, maybe my limited imagination, but it seems to me that it's a process that can't continue indefinitely. I mean, what comes next after artificial intelligence? I mean, just suppose, you know, people's kind of, I was going to say people's worst fears are realised, but these aren't people's worst fears. These are kind of like, but people talk about all these jobs being lost, there being no need for, you know, and you can agree or disagree with it, but there's no need for translators, no need for historians, no need for surgeons when microchip controlled machines can carry out surgery more precisely. See, what I don't understand is that if there's going to be no need for jobs, and so very, very few people, there are going to be very, very few jobs for actual people to do, but there's lots of people around without jobs. Where is the profit that's being made coming from? It kind of partly relates to the talk that Pierre did, which I found very informative a couple of weeks ago, about how capitalism can how capitalism can resolve its crises. And to be honest, I was actually, unlike a lot of people in the discussion at the time, I was actually quite convinced by what you said, which was about running out of space. Because I can't actually see where capitalism goes from here beyond artificial intelligence. I don't really see that there are more, you know, maybe it's my limited imagination, but I don't really see more technical advancements on the horizon. Because once you've thrown everybody out of work, I mean, what do you do after that? And in fact, where does your money actually come from? Because the machines are not going to buy the goods that they produce. But anyway, I mean, I'm just rambling, but but yeah, I mean, I don't actually see this, I can't see how this process is going to continue for cycle after cycle after cycle, is all I'm saying. It seems to me there's some kind of crunch point coming.
Just make a general point with a real world example where, although you did mention in the talk that the nature of discipline in labour and ever novel ways of doing that to extract surplus. In Oxford you have the Cowley car plant and the BMW Mini factory. And I think they employ a employment model similar to a lot of other big firms of that nature, where the workers have a system of banking hours and time. So where the first quote talks about limits of working day and so on, if you're a worker at the factory and you've taken time off, those hours need to be made up. And there are other similar schemes where you go into a minus. For instance, a worker might have an account of minus 200 hours for whatever reason. And rather than being beholden, shackled to employment for monetary reasons, they're contractually obliged to, or fear of losing the job, in a time sense as well. So that's like a recent novel way of disciplining labour, and it's almost like serfdom. You're tied to the factory, not solely through monetary means, that formal subsumption exchange, but there's something going on where you're tied to production in another way. So you've got the employers secured labour more firmly. It's almost neo-feudal, if I throw that phrase there, but so yeah. what's going on.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Just respond to Zed. So if AI throws a lot of people into unemployment, then it will be a slump because there'll be insufficient demand in the economy. And Nikos is the economist, I'm not, so he can correct me here. But that was one of Keynes's points in criticism of the capitalist system, which is why he's hated by right-wingers, despite him being a defender of capitalism, is that capitalism has got no innate mechanism to achieve high employment. So it could be the case that there could be mass unemployment and mass misery unless states intervene to do something about it, because the market and capitalist competition in itself won't sort it out. So that's a possible future, but it could be sorted out by state intervention. At which point, my feeling is there's plenty more innovations to come, and there'll be plenty more things that people will be forced to work full working days to produce if capitalists get their way, and so it could get back to business as usual. That'll be my expectation.
Yeah, I'd be more optimistic. Well, I think I'm more optimistic where the more automation there is, the more the economy is produced. Well, not necessarily what's needed, but those necessities could be produced easier. So it's a political question more than an economic question of who owns it, who controls it, how is it planned, how is it distributed and administered. So it becomes a political question. Okay, economically, automation creates unemployment, but if there are political ways to challenge state authority or the existing setup, then we could have these these technical benefits for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a political question which sectors get automated and which kinds of automation we end up with, and that's something where potentially there's a political fight to be had. I'd be suspicious of Zed's line of reasoning, not because I want to commit myself for now to any particular opinions about AI, but because Marxists have really often said that there's a crunch coming and it can't carry on much longer like this. And various kinds of crunches have happened, but it's always wriggled out of it so far. And in that sense, I don't think we should expect that capitalism is going to run out of road and politely bow itself out of world history, or else decide to blow up the world because it can't make a profit any longer. A separate point that I've just been looking at is one of the quotes from Volume 1, Chapter 15, Section 1, talking about mechanization, is that Marx assumes that this quote here that comes up to here, Marx assumes that mechanization, that as industry becomes more mechanized, it also becomes more socialized, that production, the labourer becomes a mere appendage to the machine or whatever, and that the machine factory draws in people to be engaged in directly socialized production, and political consequences that might arise from that, in terms of trade union organisation, in terms of creating a unified class with unified experiences. And I'm not sure that technological developments now do continue to have that effect. That you get a lot of gig workers and Uber drivers who are, I don't want to tread on the toes of Mike's talk coming up about class composition, but those look a bit like pre-industrial revolution artisan workers who own their own means of production, and formally it's a putting out system from the capitalist firm, and they are less socialized. Their productive activity is less socialized now than it was whatever they were doing before they were casualized and transformed into gig economy workers. So I wonder whether that link between mechanization and obviously social production, obviously at a more abstract level is still, but you go along to the Cowley plant and you can actually see lots of workers engaged in the same productive process, whereas people who've been casualized and are more in that piecework model or whatever you want to call it, it takes more analysis to see that it's social production. That's a bit of a sidetrack from the talk. I apologise. That's just. Anybody else want to come in?
I think just in response to that, say like a Uber driver or that gig economic model, it's a worker and they're working for a wage and they're paid and there's a surplus extracted by the firm, but like I said, it's not as obvious, you can't see it. So it requires that abstract thinking and economic thinking to, say in a factory you can unionize a static workforce in one place quite easily, whereas Uber or I work in construction as a labourer and move from place to place, and we're working for agencies and so on. To organise labour in that sense, to challenge capital is very difficult. And I guess the definition of socialised means of production, how does that hold in regard to gig economy workers and agency workers and so on? How to cut through all those layers to a job that is part of society, providing a service or producing a good. How to cut through all those layers to the reality of what's going on. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No. I mean, an Uber driver does own their own means of production. They might have bought it on a loan, but the car is not provided to them by Uber. And quite a lot of gig economy workers are in that position, that they own at least some of the means of production that they use. And they are exploited. But a non-proletarian artisan worker was exploited, but hadn't yet been stripped of their means of production. And that, I think, Marx regards as being the old thing that's dying out. That you might still have watchmakers in Switzerland, and that's why they're all anarchists in the International, is because they still own their own tools. Because I think watchmaking was one of the things that it only became profitable late to do that on a production line. It was more profitable to have the separate artisans who gets the job and does it at home. Anybody else want to come in? There is still, I want to make sure that Nikos gets a kind of 10 minutes at least at the end to reply to anything, but that still leaves us a bit of time if anybody wants to.
That final point about the difficulty of determining what is social, I think, is even the case in more traditional workplaces, not even just through working from home, which seems to have come and largely gone. But I'm thinking more in terms of someone like Adorno, for whom class consciousness was so essential in how desire itself becomes socially mediated by commodity production, and how even the question of purchasing something nowadays has become so abstracted. We can pull up our phone and order something and it will arrive in the next day. That's so distant from any amount of production that the recognition that class structures society and history itself, I think, has rarely been more difficult to actually establish, and then that leads to the difficulty of identifying class antagonism and moving towards something like socialism. And so, in my mind, it's not a question of capitalism will fall and something good comes after that, but the rise of fascism into something far, far worse.
That might be an appropriate point to end the discussion. If anybody would like to chip in anything else, there's time for another contribution. Last call. If not, then thanks everybody. And in a moment, as usual, I'll ask the speaker to reply, not necessarily to everything, but to any points that you'd like to say something else on. Next week we will be back here again. I don't know which room we'll be in, but in this building somewhere, 7:30 on Thursday, and it's likely to be this room. But if not, then it'll be the other one. And the title then will be Flying Saucer Update, 3i Atlas and the Politics of Interstellar Visitation. So who knows, some of the same issues might be taken further than that. I don't think there's any other parish business. So Nikos, anything that you, and don't feel obliged to reply to everything, but anything that you'd like to reply to.
I'd rather feel, but I'll try to keep it down. One suggestion: Rendezvous with Rama, not Interstellar. That's the fly. Yeah. Actually, I'm deviating a lot, but the 3i Atlas looks more like Rama rather than anything else. But anyway, I'm into Asimov these days, which is also relevant with the robot singularity. So if I may start with 3 aphorisms. One is not mine, is Duncan Foley's, and we were discussing about a similar issue. It's not the end of work, Rifkin, it's not the technological singularity, it's not any of this. It was the climate change and how this could be the upper bound of capitalism. No. Capitalism will find a way to exceed the climate change. The problem is not that. The problem is that we may not like it. It will be a capitalist way to survive the climate change. That's the issue. And I think that's the case with most of these things, because if we go back to 1929 to 1970s, there was always a call for the end of capitalism by the left, or sometimes not even the left, the right, the center. So, and every time capitalism found a way, usually not the best, but found a way to transcend. So I think that several of these questions could fall under that. There are more into it. One of the interesting things is reskilling versus deskilling. AI doesn't just steal jobs. It restructures the labor process, as many other things did. It just does it in a specific way which we haven't fully grasped, but I don't think it will just destroy everything. At least that's my take on it. Second aphorism, that's again not mine, it comes from a professor I had in my master's, about the question whether it's a political or an economic issue. I don't think they're as separate as many people think, and to be honest, I'm not really an economist, I'm kind of a phony mathematician, so I like things to be strictly economic, because I can write down my wonderful differential equations and get rid of everything else, and when they don't work, I say, oh, it's politics. It's institutions, it's something else. But I don't think that they're that separate. Actually, Marx's point is that they're not as separate as we think. And the quote, that aphorism from my professor was, economics is politics and politics is economics. So the two of them are more interclassed than we think. It's not just a political decision which industry will be automated versus which one is not. It's a political decision, funny as it may sound, that I will wake up and go to work or not. It's just something that happens subconsciously to all of us, and we don't understand that it is a political decision. I could go with even more shocking examples, but I won't go. I actually have 4 aphorisms, sorry. The question of the long cycle being there and not there, and what is... Well, I try to skip statistics because it's lies, dumb lies, and statistics. So, again, another aphorism, not mine. You could politically handpick dates, you could institutionally handpick dates, you could technically handpick dates, and they say, this is the day that this was done, or this was introduced, or this was finished, and that's the day I choose. And indeed, a part of our choice was handpicking. It was just some handpicking that seemed to match the data. We could spend hours talking what is the proper measurement of the rate of profit, which based on what is the proper measurement of the surplus value versus the actual amount of fixed capital, what is the proper measurement of the price index that we should have to reconstruct contractives data, if we accept that these contractives data are good. I won't go into that because I think it's a spiral of its own. You could make any arguments you want based on statistics. The question is whether statistics sometimes match something more. And indeed, all of the phenomena that were mentioned, whether political or not, are part of this decision. I didn't make the political, but actually 1860s to 1870s, Franco-Prussian War and the French Commune. It's not just the 1870s, the 1770s, 1780s that have something like that. It's there too. And the last aphorism, which, this is mine, but it's copied from Marx. I think that one of the best works that Marx wrote, it's something that he never published. It's the unpublished introduction to the contribution of the critique to political economy. And in this introduction, apart from mentioning this wonderfully wrong picture about the superstructure in the basement, it is a basement, actually, it's a house. That's the really bad thing about it. Anyway, is that he says all of the economic concepts that you think as distinct are just faces of the same coin. Production and consumption are not separate things. Production and distribution are not separate things. Production and sort of consumption and investment are not separate things. They are all just the next phase of the same cycle. So if we try to see things based on the one facet versus the other, we are probably losing the fact that they're interconnected. Now, this is related to 2 things. One is, and most of them came from Ian, I think. One is whether we should be thinking of these variables as distributive variables. I think this is a nice Raffian mistake. And Marx's point of writing all these details about the industrial system in volume 1 is to show that a large part of the class struggle does not happen when the wage is to be paid, but it happens when the worker tries to destroy a machine, or when the worker strikes not to ask for a higher wage, but to ask for a shorter day, or for safety measures in the factory and so on. So there are more issues into it. Another thing is whether we see the production of surplus value as the cause of a change, and whether that rate would be justified as that. I think this is the old Keynesian debate of supply-led versus demand-led. The two of them, again, are the same, they're the different faces of the same coin. The one indeed creates the other and is created by that. That would be the proper dialectic way to see it. And to that I fully agree, by the way. Surplus value is created because of investment and at the same time causes investment. So that could be a way out of that sort of, not exactly paradox that you mentioned. What else? Oh, capitalist system as a whole was a good question, and there's a lot of ink spilled on why volume 1 looks like this, and then we have the many capitals versus the capital in abstract. I think that in order to resolve some of these questions, about what a firm does versus what the system does, if we can speak about a system. I think capitalism is a paradox in itself in that way. It's not a capitalism, it's capitalisms. In different places, different eras, they take different forms. And state intervention is one of these forms. This apparent neo-feudalism could be another form. Anyway, I think that in order to understand how the two of them are connected, we should speak about something separate, which is what are the dynamics of competition between those firms that could create an average rate of profit. By the way, my reasoning of why the law is presented there and not earlier, the law of the falling rate of profit, is exactly because if you don't discuss about competition between firms and then between industries, you cannot have that. So there's a reasoning to go there. Also, dynamics of innovation. The fact that a firm brings a better technology and cheapens its production so it raises its profit, it works the opposite for the other firms because the other firms lose. So if these are not discussed, we cannot really talk about the rest of it. And I haven't done that, unfortunately. I should have, but I didn't. Serfdom as a worker, capitalist as a seigneur. I kind of smiled at that point. I think this is a discussion that disorients, honestly. And all this techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism, or whatever discussion kind of disorients because I don't think that all these forms of quote-unquote serfdom ever left. They appear and reappear, and they disappear and then reappear in different forms and different contexts all the way through the history of capitalism, whether it's the slavery in the American South, or, by the way, historian Lazanik has made a wonderful description of how the British factories worked back in the time that we think as the perfect moment for industrial capitalism. He shows how many of those relations were not really the archetypical industrial worker that we think of. So it's not that these things were pre-capitalist and now reappear and something new happens, is that these relations always stayed, and to a large extent capitalism is based on them. So I think it's disorienting putting them in this terminology, just to be precise. I don't say they don't exist. Actually, they exist more than people say, but I think the terminology is disorienting. Similar comment, and just stop me when my time runs over because I have a lot of things to say, so sorry.
You've got about 5 minutes.
Oh, great. The question, that was also a wonderful question, that the whole thing about the gig economy and how the modern forms of exploitation look more pre-capitalistic, like going back to the artisanal. First of all, the same comment applies. Adding to that, I could speak again for a long time about the mines of Ludlow, early 20th century, where the workers were buying the wood that they used to construct the safety structure of the mine. It was not paid by Rockefeller. So they were buying part of the means of production. Could we call that an artisanal pre-capitalistic thing? I'm not sure. I think, again, we fall into that disorientation. However, and I don't know if Ian will come after my skin here, but I think that the way the law of value works is exactly the socialization of labor. And the way that this can happen is only if you can compare one person's labor with another's. And the best example for how this can happen is a conveyor belt. This is the very sad thing about Marxism, that the moment we step out of the conveyor belt, somehow things look weird. And we should stop doing that. Yet the best example you can bring is this. I faced that challenge teaching these parts to my students. And I was saying, it's the moment that my labor is actually equalized to someone else's labor because we have to follow the pace of the machine. We are not allowed to have any deviations. My labor time and their labor time is equal, full stop. It is forced to happen so. This appears to be dismantled when one has to work from their house, right? Not even from their house. The fact that we have an office with a computer here and an office with a computer there and we're not really talking, right? It looks like it's doing that. I don't think it does. We just need to change the way we looked at the conveyor belt and stop thinking about the conveyor belt the way it just did, to think about the law of value, at least. fixed length of the working day and whether the modern 24/7 capitalism kind of stops that, gives an unbounded an unbounded upper bound to the working day. I'm not sure. Marx spends a few pages talking about the lighting that changed the life in factories, allows for more shifts than one. So it's again not something new. Who was it? Thompson, I think, who wrote about the clocks and how they were used in industry. It's the same story from the 19th century all the way to today, even though Thompson didn't see it. I think that in a sense you dismantle the physical barrier and you make it more of a moral. You don't get out of the fact that there is a barrier, just the barrier now is not really the physical part of exhaustion, because the first shift goes home and sleeps and it's fine, then the second one comes in, and it's more of a moral thing, and the moral is, okay, who will be working the night shift? Who will be working the weekend? Who will be working the fifth day? Which again, capitalism has resolved. The place allows for it. A priest told me once that the worst thing that happened with the Protestant Reformation was the fact that the calendar changed, that all of this fish went away, because this meant more work. It was directly a capitalist thing, like people work more. Last thing, and I'll stop it here because I know I'm going too far already. The long cycles came from the discussion around contractive work, and there are many economists, center, left, and right, that use them, some as an artifact, some as a deity, some as something that happens. One can speak about neoclassical explanations of the long waves, like Rostow's stages of development, or like the recent Nobel Prize in Ahern and Howe. It was exactly this idea of Schumpeterian innovations driving these things. And of course, there are many ways to explain them. I think purely institutional, purely political, purely technical, purely whatever you want. I think that if we don't anchor them to something like the falling rate of profit, we are losing the fact, and even Marxists have lost that, by the way, of capitalism evolving, taking a different face now from what it had 50 years ago, but remaining capitalism, because it's bound by the same laws, like the law of value, like the law of the falling rate of profit, and so on. If we don't do that, we'll end up speaking about specificities more than generalities, and I think this is a big issue. Thank you very much. Hope.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Okay, we'll stop there. Next week, 3 IM.